So that's going to be my guy out point on the lower door. In the pattern, they just use a gross grain loop. I like to use these line locks, so that's what I've chosen to put here. So just a quick note on equipment. I do happen to have a few things around from other sewing endeavors that make this a little bit easier. The first one is this 1/4 inch foot. There we go. Is this 1/4 inch foot. So this is just, it's a foot actually made for quilting, and it's got a guide at a 1/4 inch from the center point of the needle. That makes doing these 1/4 inch seams accurately a lot easier. Another helpful piece of equipment is the single stitch throat plate that I have for this machine. It stops fabric from being pulled into the throat and down into the bobbin case when it's really thin or gauzy or slippery, because there's less of a space for it to get sucked in. That is super helpful both for the sill and the mesh, even more so the mesh. And so with both of them side by side, the zigzag plate, you can see, has a much bigger space than the single stitch plate. Just don't try to zigzag with the single stitch plate in, because then you break needles. So now the first part of the seam is done, and you can see that the seam allowance is on the right side of the fabric, which is contrary to typical seams. So the next step then is to fold it over and do another seam with the right sides together that's wider than a 1/4 inch, so then it encases that seam and you won't see it on the outside. That's a terrible demonstration, but I'm sure you get the point. Doing the second seam can be pretty tricky to keep it nice and even and your seam tight. And so one thing that is very helpful to get that seam nice and neat is to run over that seam allowance, folding it backwards until it's the way you want it, with a very, very cool iron. These are synthetics. These are very delicate synthetics at that. You want a very cold iron, like you can see that it, like I can touch it. But just that much will hold it back enough to make the seam a lot easier. Switch this around so the camera can see it better. Because the seam allowance is so large for this particular seam, you can actually keep the clips in place and sew past them, which makes it just a little bit easier even still. Another thing to be careful of when sewing these super slippery fabrics is that there isn't excess fabric from the pile creeping into your seam. That really sucks when that happens, and especially with the waterproof fabrics, because then will have put needle holes that you'll need to seal later in the middle of your canopy somewhere. So just go slow and be extra careful that you're only sewing the layers that you intend. So there we have the outside seam. The final step to this seam is to fold it open and do a run of top stitch to hold down part of the flap. So that's also going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this is another place where ironing this really, really helps. So I just noticed kind of a, well, medium-sized boo-boo. It's not too bad to fix, but this is the bottom edge of the tent. And this is my line lock. It's upside down. So I've just gotta run in, undo this stitching, and flip it over and restitch those 2 places. All right, it's all fixed up now. It's pointing the right way. Just gonna iron this down and making sure that the flap is pointing down, because this is where the mesh will be attached later. So it'll just be a bit more awkward if it's pointing up. It'd still be possible, just maybe not quite as easy. So here we have the assembled roof panel, one of them, with that seam. One thing that you can see in certain places along here is this little bit of wrinkling of the fabric. And they go in the direction that I sewed this seam. So that's an indication that my foot pressure is too high for the fabric and it's kind of dragging it along as I go. So I'll loosen that up for the next one and hopefully they will go away or won't be quite so bad. They are just cosmetic. This seam is perfectly functional. It's actually pretty neat as far as these things go. There's no puckers or wrinkles or tucks. So yeah, on to the next one. Last seam, just the center one at the top, and then the roof panel is done. This one is cat cut, but otherwise it's exactly the same as the others. Given what a high stress point this seam is, I'm just gonna run a couple extra lines of stitching just to make sure everything's extra secure.